Simone Reid-Henry, and I've had the pleasure of directing and establishing the IHSS over much of the past year. We've gone from strength to strength in recent months, despite all that has happened, and I look forward to continuing to supporting faculty at Queen Mary in developing our programme of activity in the months and years ahead. You can find out much more about the sort of things we do on our website at qmul.ac.uk/IHSS. Our partner for today, the City Centre, began sometime before the IHSS as an initiative under a former colleague of mine, Jane Wills, and around the time my own tenure at Queen Mary began in the mid-2000s. It's now in the hands of Regan Koch, lecturer in human geography, who I'll introduce to chair today's seminar in a moment. Today's event is a first for us in another sense, it being broadcast live to all of you who've dialed in from around the world to watch and to listen. And I'm thrilled that we have such a sterling lineup to discuss from their own perspectives the manner in which the COVID-19 lockdowns and their associated transformations of social life, public and private, has transformed urban living. To what ends and with what degree of permanence remains perhaps to be seen, as will the extent to which this plays out differently in very different cities around the globe. We've become familiar with the national accounting of the response. We've heard much less, at least until today, about the comparative urban perspective. Regan will introduce all our speakers in just a moment, but I'd like first to register my personal thanks to Anna-Louise Milne from ULIP, AbdouMaliq Simone from the University of Sheffield, and Alan Latham from UCL for their contributions, and to the IHSS Administrator, Nen Chaku, for making today's seminar operational. A couple of matters of housekeeping before I hand over. First, if you would like to ask a question, please do so using the chat facility on the Blackboard interface. Regan will be monitoring and will be able to pose your question to the panel. Please therefore include your full name and affiliation when writing this. And secondly, we plan to finish on schedule at 5 p.m. So with that, I'll hand over to Regan, and thank you very much, Regan, for chairing today's event.
Sure, thank you, Simon, and thanks to the more than 130 of you now who are logged in here this afternoon. I've no doubt that the enthusiastic turnout owes a great deal to our three speakers who've agreed to present today. So I'd like to just briefly introduce, in the order that they'll be presenting, starting with Professor Anna-Louise Milne, who's a cultural historian at the University of London and Paris, or ULIP. Anna-Louise is a cultural historian who focuses on 20th century literature, theory, and migration studies. Alongside her academic pursuits, Anna-Louise has long been involved in developing volunteer networks to support refugees and migrants in Paris, and she's going to tell us just a bit about that today. Secondly, we have Professor AbdouMaliq Simone, who's an urbanist now at the University of Sheffield. His research focuses on the social and spatial composition of cities and urban regions, and it focuses on the everyday lives of those surviving at the margins. AbdouMaliq and the graphic engagements in cities across Asia and Africa are at the very forefront of debate and theory in contemporary urban studies. And so we're particularly keen to hear his perspective on the current situation. And then thirdly, we have Alan Latham, who's an urban geographer at UCL. Alan's a prolific writer whose work explores sociality and public life, globalization and the urban cultural economy, and various forms of corporal mobility in cities. Alan recently has been developing the idea of social infrastructure as a way of researching and valuing urban public spaces. And we think this is a productive way of thinking about the city in a time of social distancing. So we're going to briefly hear from each of the three speakers, and then we'll be opening up the discussion to questions from each of you. So thanks again for joining us, and I'll hand over to Anna-Louise to start the conversation.
Okay, thank you, Regan. I hope everybody can hear me. And thank you, Simon, Musab, and Nena for involving me in this discussion. I'm really psyched to hear everything that's going to be said today. I'm going to be reading, which may be obvious or not to you, and if I'm drawing attention to that fact, it's perhaps because it's not that obvious to me to sit in front of a screen and read from a screen. And I've always found the move between speaking and reading difficult, and I'm not quite sure how it's going to work in this new environment with that smaller adjustment that I might have to make just right as my eyes move between the page, the screen, the camera, and so on. But if I'm drawing attention to this fact, it's not just in self-preoccupation, but rather because the sorts of adjustments, these sorts of adjustments, how we feel our way into new spaces and seek our new points of equilibrium, our ways to lean in. And these processes are what I want to start by exploring briefly. More specifically, I want to honor the work of the Permanence chorégraphique de la Chapelle, which I might translate as a choreographic drop-in center at La Chapelle, an organization that imagines itself as something like office hours, where dance gets created as required. And the idea of permanence is important in this too. The Permanence is part of a deep and complex web of actions and informal economies that crisscross the La Chapelle neighborhood behind the Gare du Nord in Paris. It's one of the poorest and densest parts of the inner city, also an important intersection with the banlieue, as well as the place that has seen most of the major inner city camps of asylum seekers in Paris. Unsurprisingly, it's also seen some of the highest levels of COVID-19 infection in Île-de-France, as well as some of the more stringent modes of surveillance of lockdown protocols. In this context, the Permanence and the dance it has invited regularly in public spaces for years now played a significant, perhaps an essential role in the continuation of the Petit Déjeuner Solidaire. These Petit Déj are a breakfast distribution which extends into the collection and redistribution of information, clothes, advice, music, unexpected capacities and uncontrollable affects. It's been going for several years now, convened on a daily basis by one of the numerous autonomous collectives in the La Chapelle area. Tolerated by the local authorities, but never authorized, always vying with and adapting to their shifts in policy, as well as to changing priorities in municipal and national policing, and broader external factors and their violent repercussions, ranging from border control to rising numbers of crack users because of restrictions in psychosocial healthcare. Committed to a daily presence and a welcoming breakfast, the Petit Déj are also engaged in sporadic actions aimed towards other spheres of attention. Now, I'm sketching in these few characteristics of the Petit Déj because as the viral spread disrupted all bodily norms, the question this new reality posed was brutal for this network, and especially for its most seasoned militants. To continue or not? And I'm reconnecting with that question, which was posed so intensely over a couple of evenings on the 16th and 17th of March through a wildfire of phone calls and list posts that wanted to sense out the readiness, the willingness, the capacities, the critical mass or not. Because at this point, in this extraordinary cycle that we are all living, that is, I think, our question. How what we know and what we have done, how what we have energized and taken in, confound our venturing on. What, even in the face of what was in those specific days of mid-March in Paris, a sense of wildly immeasurable threat, enabled the Petit Déj to continue on the same autonomous basis when the streets were suddenly subject to such all-pervading control and anxiety. But back to permanence, or continuation, because I'm not sure I have much to say about the sudden surges of solidarity that have been acknowledged through these past weeks. Are they part of a compensatory desire to feel useful, or a way of getting out and having the right to stray beyond one's own first necessities? Both, no doubt, and more. And meanwhile, solidarity has been viciously swept up into governmental discourse that now fleshes out its pedagogical posture with gratitude to sacrifices made, labour given in the name of the general good. So I'm wary of premising new horizons on such a surge, and I'd rather note that here too a longer frame is useful. For the risk of becoming part of the furniture or a willing appendage to the state's abandonment of people to the streets or worse is no new dilemma. And this is where I get back to dance. For dance, perhaps first and foremost, is a mode of exuberance, an excess, if you like, that sports its refusal to be merely useful. It is also a constant negotiation of bodies in space, an attunement to variable alignments, a sensing of possibility, a practice that can begin with a few gestures, perennial gestures, or gestes pérennes, in the words of Laetitia Anjou of the Permanence chorégraphique at La Chapelle. And it is in these aspects primarily, exuberant and yet variously conditioned, that it helped shape the transition for the Petit Déj from a practice where a premium was placed on friendly proximity, on resisting the sort of one-size-fits-all efficiency-driven food packages distributed by institutional actors, to a sudden scramble to preserve distance, to avoid hand contact, and so on. Dance quite literally defined the space in which this scene worked out its moves from within a complex configuration of imperatives, fears, and desires. But at the risk of overstretching within this frame, and also in so noting that risk, touching back effort that I want also to be mine here, to think this interaction as it extends for me from my 17-inch screen outwards to the continuity with that other space of physical proximity in La Chapelle, I want to add an element to the dance, and that is the fence or barrier, and bring other of the new collocations that, like social distancing in English, now pepper our language. I'm referring to the French expression geste de barrière, which groups all our new or reinforced habits, hand washing, gel, masks, all vital gestes barrières. So how do they relate to the choreographer's gestes de pérenne, or perennial gestures? Another factor in the successful and consolidated continuation of Petit Déjeuner Solidaire in the eye of the storm in Île-de-France was also the availability of fences, mobile enclosure fences such as you can see on the screen, strangely ineffectual fences, in fact, for a neighbourhood of considerable social unrest and heavy policing. But these particular fences had been intended to delimit an urban farm that was itself a gesture on the part of the city to claim its family-oriented prerogatives in the very space of the distribution, where a heterogeneous group of hungry people had been gathering every day for years. They are, in this respect, an example of lightweight urban control, the effects of which were potentially insidious for the petit-déj, and seemed to be so when they arrived to enter their enclosure and established the farm in mid-February. But by mid-March, these same fences became, at least for now, productive of unexpected facilities. It took, reportedly, a night of insomnia for one member of the collective of the Petit-Déj to see that taking the abandoned fences from the farm after it had shut up shop for lockdown and using them in another sort of daily dance that sees them being installed in the street every day would be a helpful process. And perhaps a night of insomnia is one measure we can all feel of what this sort of test involves, with its recurrent impulses and its gradual emergence into something else. The idea of framing access around the distribution with fences that impose queues was a hard one to reach. And I don't think anyone in the network would want these fences to become part of the furniture either. But as my little view from Paris out, the fact is that they are mobile infrastructure, and in their role towards managing the violence, ambivalence, and ordinary contingencies of the Petit Déjeuner intersection in lockdown, they enable me to acknowledge AbdouMaliq and Michele Lanconi's great pieces on bio-austerity and solidarity in COVID-19 spaces, and their suggestion that we need to think about how we handle the infrastructure that surrounds us. Perhaps the practice of gesture, whether perennially reinvented or adopted under the strictures of state action, can help us hold together some of the strands of what we hold to with the permanence of our commitment and are provisionally held by, to the dance and the distancing. But the fences also point me in conclusion towards Lauren Berlant's thoughts about infrastructure for troubling times, where she writes that infrastructure is, I quote, that which binds us to the world in movement and keeps the world practically bound to itself. And as one final point in a paper that has chosen to place its emphasis on mobility, and as La Chapelle today begins to revert to its regular condition of a point de fixation in the language of the police, or a point of fixation, a point of gathering that gets stuck, Berlant is useful for her emphasis on boundedness or on socially necessary proximity. There are multiple ways in which the Petit-Déj refract larger world-oriented labour, in their intersection with the experimentation in circular economies, in their effective and creative investments in concepts and practices of hospitality and of critique and counterintelligence. But yanking back on these world-building horizons is always the simple and difficult fact of large numbers of persons abandoned in various ways by capital and public interest, threatened by repressive forces too. And if the petit-déj continued against what felt like unknown risk on 16th of March, then it was, I think, because it felt complexly and necessarily bound to itself and its world as a première nécessité. And I'll stop there for now and leave you just with some references. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna-Louise. So much to think about there. If you're ready, AbdouMaliq, we'll go ahead and hand over to you.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Thanks, everyone, for coming. When one has their mobility restricted, you tend to have a very skewed perspective on your surrounds. And having my mobility constricted in a corridor that is halfway between London Fields and Victoria Park, it's a fairly skewed view on a surrounds that is really seeped in all these displays of white millennial narcissism, and where one could easily conclude that social distancing is really a distance from the ability to be social. And so to try to get out of this very skewed view and to need to restore some kind of sense of mobility, I've spent a lot of time talking with friends and partners who work in cities across the South and trying to understand and work and reflect together about ways in which a different kind of sociality is really at stake. And particularly important to this process has been conversations with partners in Cairo, in Mumbai, in Karachi, and in Jakarta. And so it's very clear that the pandemic conditions are grafted onto very significant restructurings of urban space and urban processes that have been underway. And an aspect of those kinds of restructurings has been this intense movement toward accelerated formalization of all kinds, and a formalization which essentially is a kind of way of trying to settle largely unsettled populations. Unsettled, not in the sense that these are footloose residents, but rather unsettled in the sense of their emplacement within heterogeneity of different kinds of economic games and ways of doing things that oftentimes are very difficult to read and therefore control. And in relationship to these accelerated processes of formalization, there have been two responses. One of which is that certain residents dig in. And by digging in, they, in some sense, retreat further within the kinds of spaces of opacity that particular kinds of residencies and occupations and work avail. And on the other hand, there is the process of spreading out, where residents in some ways leave for more peripheral spaces of operation. And so this process of digging in and spreading out then within pandemic conditions confront a state or states that attempt to round up, attempt to corral, attempt to blockade, and the particular interaction of these processes produces particular kinds of perspectives in and of themselves. So on the one hand, for example, the common refrain is that as the states attempts to, and as state and NGOs and variety organizations attempt to attempt to roll out much more elaborate provisioning systems within a kind of crisis period, there's the discovery in some sense that the household isn't what the conventional understandings of the household tend to be. That those very things that are being attempted to be increasingly formalized and regulated and brought into some kind of view tend to be composed in ways which are sometimes, in a sense, are unanticipated. And what this will mean, it's in some sense it's unclear. There's been a lot of emphasis on notions of de-densification. And in this image that you see, I mean, this is a kind of emblematic image of the dangerous classes, a kind of density which is increasingly dangerous, that entails increased numbers of vulnerabilities for those that operate within them. And certainly to some extent that's the case. But there's a lot that we don't know about how these kinds of densities are actually performed. And so that becomes a kind of important consideration. What I want to focus on a little bit is the sense that if de-densification is increasingly a kind of imperative, and if pandemic conditions are simply going to double down and accelerate these kinds of apparatuses of formalization already underway, then where are people going to go? Where's the kind of imagined space of resettlement that is available for policymakers and states and residents themselves? And these then increasingly are the peripheries, the hinterlands of large urban regions. And in just the few moments I have, I just want to show some images of what those extended urban regions look like. And the point I want to make is that these are built environments that in significant ways are not locked down. That is, that they contain within them a multiplicity of different kinds of built environments, different kinds of land uses, different kinds of financial investments, different kinds of operations, different kinds of residents that sit uneasily right next to each other, but oftentimes have no real discernible relationships with each other. That is, in some sense, there's a contiguity of convenience where it's very unclear just exactly how they're relating to each other. But more importantly, within many of these kinds of extended regions, whether it be in terms of migrant housing, factories, ongoing agricultural production, warehouses, dry ports, storage places, industrial zones, mega developments, you have a complexion of these environments, which in some ways is half empty and half full. Is what they're intended to be used for is never entirely what they end up being used for. So in some ways, when I say that these are areas that are not locked down, they in some sense have a kind of volatility of their own. And so if we're talking about the kind of wholesale relocation of urban residents increasingly toward the periphery, then I think we have to understand that the periphery exists now as a kind of unstable place of which a certain kind of politics, a certain kind of approach needs to be thought through. So I just, in these, this is in some sense some photos of a place called Cikarang on the periphery of Jakarta, and it shows you all the different types of built environments that are within this kind of region. And in each of these, there is a sense of incompletion, as if they had been built to be intentionally incomplete, as if they had been built in some ways to automatically not be or not become what the intention was. And so then I think this is a critical aspect in terms of what happens if we think about new domains of urban residence. And in some ways, what takes place is in some ways that those that come to these peripheries now don't come to them with the assumption that these are going to be the places, that these are the kinds of destinations in which they stay. In some sense, for them, these are very temporary emplacements. These are provisional forms of inhabitation from which something else might emerge. It's not clear what it is going to emerge, but in some way, this is a kind of moment of time. Because fundamentally, what I think has taken place is that the advantages of density, of urban core, working class, lower class neighborhoods before, was the intensive circulation of many different things. The intensive circulation not only of bodies, but of different kinds of economic practices, materials, resources, vernaculars, ways of doing things. And increasingly, the circulation now has become the mode of inhabitation quite literally, where people approach the notions of residence as something that is temporary, a kind of platform from which then they circulate through the urban region, trying to look for what might be the most advantageous opportunity, the most viable kind of emplacement, but with a real sense of provisionality. So what I'll leave with is, in some sense, the way in which habitation increasingly is a way of occupying a logistical imagination. It's not looking for the definitive and most healthy and most advantageous place to stay, but rather a kind of way of circulation in search of eventualities that are not clear at the moment. So in this kind of condition of lockdown, of trying to fix populations to particular spaces and circumstances, this in some ways really goes against the grain of what has been now the tendency of a majority urban population as a way in which to inhabit the city. And what comes out of that tension, what comes out of this kind of disjuncture, of course, remains to be seen, but I just want to emphasize the importance of this particular disjuncture at this moment. Thank you.
Thank you so much, AbdouMaliq, and for the images as well. It was great to see those as you spoke. If you're ready, Alan, I'll go ahead and hand over to you.
Yeah. Okay, so thanks for the invite and everything. I'm going to speak up for the millennials of Northeast London, AbdouMaliq. So, yeah, so I'm going to talk about, some just very kind of personal responses to this period of social distancing. And I'd like to start just with talking about all those kind of things that we've been missing, what I've been missing anyway during the lockdown. And it's a whole lot of really kind of routine, boring stuff, the routine of getting the kids to school, that I miss the commute, cycling to work, the flaky aggression of London cyclists, of whom I'm one of. I miss dropping off to a cafe for a coffee. I miss going to shops and not being nervous about other people entering the shop and infecting me. I miss crowds. I miss the feeling of breaking into the light you get when you've come up the 2 levels of escalators at Euston Station, coming out of a tube. I miss cinema. I miss looking at people's sneakers on the underground. I miss meeting people in pubs for a meeting. I miss having to swerve. I miss not having to swerve away from strangers when they come towards you. So I miss a whole range of routines and rhythms of my previous life, of I guess for a lot of us, our previous lives. And I miss the public spaces of those lives. Sorry, just sorting out how to move the slides on. So there's a bit of North East London for you. Of course, one of the really interesting things about the social lockdown that has been happening in the UK is the way that a whole lot of public spaces in cities are not only still there, but we're still using them, and they become really important in all sorts of ways to negotiating the social distancing that we're involved in, using park for exercise, but also spaces to get away from the claustrophobia of being stuck in a small flat or house. Sidewalks to allow us to queue for all the things that we might want to buy in our one outing to go shopping, or roads even that allow us to keep a distance while we're walking around or exercising or whatever. So for me, one of the things that living in a city defined by physical social distancing is highlighted is just the importance of a whole range of social infrastructures to making cities work. Spaces like the parks already mentioned, but also a whole range of other kinds of spaces, right? So social infrastructure is a term that I'm borrowing primarily from the sociologist Eric Kleinenberg, and it's a term that I've been trying to think with a colleague of mine, Jack Layton. And these are the physical spaces and facilities that are open to a broad range of people that foster social lives in a neighbourhood or in a city. So things like libraries, sidewalks, shops, leisure centres, sports facilities, cafes, markets, places of worship, to name a few examples. And most of these places, the sociability isn't necessarily the primary purpose, but the act of doing a whole range of different things fosters some sense of being with others, as being part of the act of using together, being part of some kind of loose sense of community or kind of wider social something or other, right? And this sociality, and this has become really kind of apparent to me just in terms of the muteness of the public life of London that I currently inhabit. It has a whole range of different registers. So there's the classic kind of co-presence for just being with others, but there's also the sociability and friendship, the kind of meeting of those who we know and care about. There's also the whole exercise of care and kinship, the whole act of going and meeting family and friends and so on. And of course, there's the whole sociality of the kinesthetics of walking, but also the exercising. One of the few things that has kind of been allowed or even kind of heightened in the current kind of lockdown. But also there's this register of a carnival and the collective, this kind of sense of the coming together of bodies in a kind of liminal kind of sense, doing what one would not ordinarily be doing. And of course, there's a sociality of the kind of civic, the coming together to kind of work together and so on, right? And one of the things that's really interesting about the current lockdown is the way in which there's a whole range of spaces which could and should operate as really useful social resources, as really useful bits of social infrastructure, which don't for a whole range of reasons, because they've been handed over to much more kind of instrumental kind of ideas. So a kind of obvious bit about this is just streets in places like London and New York and most affluent kind of car-dominant parts of the world, where actually huge amounts of the space outdoors in cities is actually given over to the instrumental idea of vehicles moving around, right? So as this kind of slide from 9th Avenue in New York City kind of gives a sense of, right? And this kind of is the way which most planners and planners kind of actually think about cities, and there's kind of a deeply ingrained kind of sense of habit about what these spaces are for, just in terms of how we're using them, and in terms of, as I said, how planners and so on are planning them. And one of the few, maybe potentially kind of positive things to come out of this lockdown is the potential maybe to kind of start thinking in some more inventive, some more expansive, some more experimental kind of ways about these kinds of spaces. So we can see the example of Vilnius in Lithuania, where in response to the demands of social distancing, but also a desire to keep some kind of public social life going, the local authorities have tried to give over as much of the street space as possible to allow and restaurants to use these spaces to keep these kinds of this kind of social life kind of alive. Or we can think about kind of ways in which some municipalities have been closing streets off to actually allow people to exercise. I've actually been thinking about them beyond the kind of idea as simply a mode for transport and so on, right? And we can think about the ways that connects with existing kind of patterns and practices in other parts of the world. So, like in Latin America, the tradition of a ciclovia, where streets are closed on Saturdays. Or we can think of the ways in which some cities there's kind of more concrete plans to close off streets to encourage cycling and walking, which maybe could move to kind of more imaginative kind of ways of actually turning our streets back into some kind of different kind of space. But of course, the thing about what a city is at one kind of a level is a city is just a great big machine for communication, communication in all sorts of different kinds of ways, right? And they can be that kind of machine for communication in ways that emphasizes certain kinds of communication and not others, right? So we can kind of reach back and think about certain kind of imagining of the city, so which emphasize a kind of the importance of actually being at a distance from each other. So for example, 200 years ago, Thomas Jefferson, thinking about the yellow fever epidemic, which has swept through Philadelphia in 1793, developed a plan where only every second block would be built. So essentially to this very kind of split off kind of city. So each of the blank squares in this plan wouldn't be built. And as he put it, every square of houses would be surrounded by 4 open squares, and every house will front an open square. The atmosphere of such a town would be like that of a country, unsusceptible to miasma, which produced yellow fever. And of course, this is part of like a long tradition of planning and design and thinking about cities, which is circulating in the English-speaking world, at least, which kind of thinks of cities as something which should become much more Arcadian. Cities like 1970s New Zealand, which is where I'm from and where I grew up, where cities were described by a visitor once as, while beautifully planned, so laid out you wonder how long they've been dead. That's from Austin Mitchell in his book Half Gallon, Quarter Acre Paradise. Cities like Milton Keynes, which of course are great places in all sorts of ways, but they're also designed around a certain kind of idea about social distancing, a certain kind of idea about kind of separating things out. And of course, these places can be extraordinarily successful. We can look at places like Palo Alto and much of Silicon Valley, which is kind of built on this kind of this kind of template. We can also, or we should also be thinking about the ways in which the ideas about social distancing, the idea about how we're dealing with this kind of pandemic, might be pushing us more into that kind of imagining of how cities might come, forgetting about the pleasures of a certain kind of kinesthetic, tactile sense of living in the city. And this is a quote from the memoir of a writer, Dubrovka Grisic, which has this wonderful kind of sense of just the pleasures of being in a dense urban crowd. And I'm going to stop there. So thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Alan, and thanks again to all three of you. I think there's some really interesting connections across all three of your talks, and I like that they're coming from different places as well. The very first question that popped up came from Sarah, a key worker in the UK, who, in getting to work, has noticed dynamic ways that queues and barriers have started to form in her town. And she's asking specifically for examples of other ways that people are queuing or perhaps taking turns sharing space or being where they need. So I want to ask Sarah's question about examples of other people queuing, but also just extending that out to thinking about, in the socially distanced city, how do we take turns? How do we make sure that the public space that is there can be equally accessed? Is there a need for new norms and behaviors that are perhaps emerging from in your observations? I don't know who wants to take that first.
Well, one thing I'd say about that, if I can go first, is one of the things that strikes me about the question of turn taking is actually that things like online shopping and so on, in a sense, have become these kind of machines to avoid having to confront those kinds of problems. Like the turn taking ends up being delegated to your delivery slot, or delegated to the delivery people themselves. So there is a way in which we're developing quite different ways of doing things like provisioning and so on, which are orientated about the fact that we're not trying to interact with people, we're trying to avoid that kind of interaction, which could have quite profound implications on what kind of cities we end up with.
Anna-Louise or AbdouMaliq, do you have anything to add on that? Sharing and taking turns.
Hi, I'll just come back in again a little bit on the question of the fences. If you can, everybody hear me? Yep. Yeah, no, I think it's just I mean, the question of the fences in the context that I was describing was just is a tense one, precisely because the primary public that was coming to these breakfast distributions is a public that is so often kind of hounded into queuing situations, and there's such a premium placed on not having to operate that type of restriction and social control. And so just really, I think that those fences became, in that context, a kind of a very delicate maneuvering of how to find some sort of appropriate way. So, and I just think it's quite interesting they're objects of fundamental ambivalence, basically. And I suppose that's the main thing that I want to draw attention to in that context, is the way in which we can see them as operating in a repressive and difficult way, but also as enabling. And perhaps what they did in this context enable was the continuation of something that has felt fundamentally really important. So it's just kind of taking on board that kind of that sense of possibility that was a disruptive possibility. And in terms of other examples, I think I suppose that makes me think of situations of good humor, of music, of different ways in which, yes, practices that might be close to something like the exuberance of dance that's come and inhabited and occupied the space of the queue, and that shows the faceted nature of those sorts of situations and the capacity to overcome their repressive, constraining aspects. I'll stop there.
Yeah, super interesting. Perhaps I'll go on to the next question then, which is about the fact that the internet or the screen for many of us is our primary public space at the moment. And of course, this is exposing and exacerbating certain sort of inequalities. It's also potentially amplifying fears about the erosion of the public sphere. And so I wanted to hear, and this is a question from Anna-Louise, but to add on to that, the intensified importance of the digital or the screen in our lives. What new challenges or opportunities does that potentially present, both in our current moment, but also looking forward, looking ahead? Does that raise new questions of public good?
Well, in the cities that I'm referring to, the screen is basically SMS and WhatsApp, and the pervasiveness of WhatsApp as a means of conveying information is quite important and useful. But on the other hand, it's also vulnerable to spreading all kinds of weird information all over the place, which people's own everyday transactions in the street used to be the kind of medium through which a kind of story was negotiated. So the reality of a situation was the product of a kind of negotiability, a face-to-face negotiability, as stories wound their way through a variety of different transactions. And without that kind of mediation, then the screen is a kind of purveyor of all kinds of statements, which it becomes increasingly difficult to sort out in terms of how useful or true or valid they might be. And particularly now, this has an important effect in terms of what people think it is that they should be doing, or where they should turn when they are experiencing particular kinds of difficulty.
Thank you, AbdouMaliq. Anna-Louise or Alan, did you want to comment on that?
I suppose what I would add is also at this point it seems really important not to get too stuck in the opposition between the screen environment and the physical environment, and rather to think about how we actually are all the time moving between the two of them, and I suppose that my way of kind of thinking that through for myself is obviously, as everybody else, nonetheless vastly more restricted in my movement than I was previously. But if I think back to the types of movement, and particularly to that kind of key moment of trying to think, can we sustain this sort of activity? How do we sustain it? That actually that sustaining of physical presence was only possible because there was already a very robust kind of digital presence, a digital support that enabled the type of communications that enabled the then in the street presence. And so I think it's it's tempting at the moment to think in terms of dichotomies, physical, digital, but actually I'm not sure that that's that helpful, and that there's something really important about thinking the continuity of these, basically.
Okay, my next question comes from David in the west of Scotland, who asks, maybe perhaps in line with all three of your talks. He says, we see streets being reclaimed by neighborhoods and communities for different kinds of collective experiences, things like parties and festivities and the nightly socializing and things. He's wondering if these temporary features, these temporary uses of public space might become more permanent over the long run, and what would that take from the local state in terms of governance and regulation to think about perhaps some permanent changes in our public realm.
Shall I go?
Sure. I think so.
Well, I mean, I think that's part of the, one of the potentially kind of really interesting things coming out of what is happening is this potential to reimagine what these spaces are for, and to use them in these different ways, to think of different ways of kind of being connected with others. I mean, the question is in terms of how robust and how robust these changes are and how to make them more permanent, will kind of rely on other kind of prosaic things like just changing about how people are moving around in cities. So, people will be needing to be walking and cycling and doing those actually very, want a bit of term, kind of traditional kind of urban kind of ways of moving, and they needed to be given the opportunity to do so, or they'll just be crowded out again as soon as people start moving around more. So it's going to require an imaginative jump in those in power and those who are involved in managing those kinds of spaces, to allow for these things to become more permanent.
I mean, my only concern here in some ways is that yes, the streets are being appropriated for all different kinds of uses, but I guess what concerns me is the extent to which the right to the city is often expressed as the right of way. The insistence that I have the right of way. That there's something about the sensuousness of the street, the ability of large numbers to move with each other in a kind of choreography of attunement, which I think in some ways is not always evident within northern context. I mean, if one imagines the way in which millions of people can move through Old Delhi in a way that it viably not running all over each other, I can't imagine that taking place within London, for example. So what concerns me sometimes is that capacity of a kind of collective dance that somehow is attuned to each other in a way that somehow I think a lot of us have lost that capacity to be in the street in that way. And I think that if the street becomes a kind of, I mean, I understand all that Alan has been saying, and it's quite valid. But there's something about the sensitivity of the street which I think needs to be recouped, and that's a much more affective, intuitive way of being rather than a kind of negotiated consensus as to how particular uses are to be determined.
Yeah, I mean, I would just add that I think that the use of festivities in the street and street parties and so on is a really kind of that fits for me with that sense of kind of, especially when it's given that the question is what role does the local state play in facilitating or preserving these types of initiatives. That seems like a number of relatively lightweight consensual sorts of municipal policies, which at the same time can be extremely excluding and are used quite sort of evidently as means of wresting back control in certain spaces. So you can see really clearly how you'll get spaces that are opened up to informal usages, which will then become the spaces of sanctioned parties. And this thing is kind of moving around all the time. But I think some of the spaces that we were seeing on the periphery of Jakarta are kind of those feel quite like the sorts of spaces that you can see, for example, migrant camps even in northern European cities, and then becoming spaces of sanctioned festivities that still look quite camp-like, but which are nonetheless kind of recouped within the perimeter of local authority authorization. And I think some of the things that I've been interested in recently are definitely about how people test those limits and work within them, and you know, or out with them. I'm not quite sure, but around them in any case, around those limits. It seems important to think in those terms.
Let's take one last question if we can. It's from Jeff Gilbert at the American University of Paris, who's asking about the sort of surplus population, the surplus labor that simply can't be absorbed by contemporary modes of production, contemporary modes of employment. Who Jeff's suggesting become more visible now, you know, literally on the streets at a time when other people are off, perhaps. If so-called surplus populations are more visible right now, what's the political valence of that? How does that become amplified as a matter of public concern, and rather than perhaps just a danger to be distanced from? Where do the politics of the city go, I suppose?
I mean, for example, what you see to a large extent within India is these surplus worker populations that are, you know, really intrinsic to keeping the machinery of the city going. When the machinery of the city doesn't go, all that they have left basically is to attempt to try to exert some kind of control over who they are, and so you find lots of people literally beginning to walk long distances back to where they supposedly come from, because they want to think through, well, you know, what do we do and what's likely to happen? And so it's not only a matter of the relationship of the state and apparatuses of control in relationship to the surplus populations, but surplus populations themselves in this moment actively trying to rethink what their particular position and role is vis-a-vis the machinery of the city itself. And it's not clear what that kind of implicit negotiation is going to produce.
Yeah, I would add to that. I mean, thought it was really fascinating to think like listening to that idea of what you said, AbdouMaliq, about the de-densification and then the peripheral, the spread out, and then just thinking again, certainly about the lived experience for me has been so much that sense of the visibilization of a population that is just not going anywhere, and that comes back to this question of this point of fixation, this idea of hotspots, these people maintained with no possible movement forward, but also no possible movement back. So in states of kind of administrative and legal limbo, essentially, and minimal, not no sources of economic activity, but minimal and extremely unstable sources of economic activity to enable subsistence within those spaces. And so certainly that becoming that conundrum, that kind of drama becoming incredibly visible in the streets. And I think in terms of the political valency, again, this experience of watching this situation unfold within the very localized area of La Chapelle, and watching it obviously from a distance, as everybody is always at some sort of distance at the moment, is to feel that the impulse was very much just to try and to sort of be to kind of try and understand what this was, what this proximity was, and the thinking of that proximity was one of just basic, of something just about not being able to get out of it, even for those who possibly could, even for those who could make the decision to leave, but that was what their condition is, to be, even from a window, to be seeing this. So kind of comments like, it's downstairs for me, I can't, and for that not really to be having a political valency, and not in the thinking at that time, but rather to be kind of shot through with that ambivalence of necessity. And certainly I think that's what's been hardest for me to think, is how I can't necessarily sort of fold that up towards the political abstractions of denouncing a system, a migratory system, the Dublin system, or either of trying to kind of valorize a system of hospitality, but rather really thinking within that framework of first necessities. And just that being the fact that underpinned the action. I'm not sure if that's particularly clear, but I think it was very present in what people said and thought.
Yeah, I mean, I might just kind of turn it kind of around slightly, because one of the things that strikes me about what's going on in a place like London is that we don't know what's becoming redundant. And there's a whole range of ways in which people have made a living, and used, the kinds of place that London is to make a living, which, potentially are going to be, if not disappearing, we're going to have a completely different kind of shape to them. And there's going to be a whole lot of kind of jobs and skills and capacities and so on, which may well become kind of redundant. And it's going to be kind of like a slow burn, kind of a sense of people becoming redundant, which could potentially be across quite a wide range of actual kind of social expertise and kind of social classes, right? So, it's a different kind of temporality to it, but it's kind of interesting, kind of what that will mean over the next, 6 months, couple of years, and so on. If a lot of the kind of measures that we've been experiencing kind of, dig in and become part of a new normal.
I think at that, we're going to go ahead and have to draw to a close. I think you've given us so much to think about, the three of you, in terms of both the situation we're in now, the geographical differences that comprise it, but also thinking about, is it 6 months or a year or 18 months that we start to answer some of the questions that we posed today? And with that, I just want to draw it to a close. I'll hand back over to Simone, who I think wanted to send us off.
Yeah, hi, thank you so much, Regan, for chairing and fielding questions, and thanks to you all in the audience for posing them. I'm sorry we couldn't get to them all. So let me draw today's seminar to a close with a final special thanks to our three speakers, Anna-Louise, AbdouMaliq and Alan, for their fascinating insights. We've heard about the resonances of urban spaces, the importance of proximity and exuberance. We've heard about de-densification and provisionality and the currently lost value of urban routine. There's so much to think about from all of this, and also from some of the comments that we've had in the chat. A thread that runs through all seems to be the underlying issue of what forms of physicality and performance, of dance and inhabitation in that fuller sense, rather than the austere contractarian approach that perhaps once held out a model of justice, but which today seems to be too easily co-opted by a colder state in its efforts at self-preservation. A call perhaps to celebrate the value of informality. Something there is that does not love a wall, as Robert Frost once wrote. And on that note, I'll bid you all farewell and thank you for coming. And you can find out about other events coming up on our website. Good evening and stay well.